Hi and welcome to a new episode of the State of the Net Podcast Quarantine Edition. I'm Paolo Valdemarin.
And I'm Ewan Simple.
And we're still stuck at home.
Well, actually, you say stuck at home. I've had one or two people online sort of get slightly tetchy with me about not being miserable. In the sense that, I know we're very lucky. We've got a garden, we live near countryside. And I know that some people are going through really, really shit times at the moment. But at one level, we've got our kids with us. Things have slowed down a lot. We've all noticed how we've sort of got more time. Instead of being on top of each other, we've actually got more time for each other. And it's just a really interesting readjustment. And it's sort of actually triggered a number of posts that I've done about just that general opportunity out of this. And again, not to minimise the suffering and distress that the coronavirus is causing, but, how many times ever, never mind in a lifetime, do you get a global reset opportunity? And in fact, I never thought I'd hear myself quoting Bill Gates in a podcast, but he was saying, it's like a war, but there's no enemy. There's just us, so we're pulling together. And, it's just made me wonder about how, if we come out of this, how much we make the most of that opportunity.
Did you read Bill Gates in The Economist this week? Is a quote in Churchill. And
is he?
Yes, and he said that this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Interesting.
In the sense that he's saying, we're seeing some change overall, especially in Western countries, and it's not the end, but maybe it's the end of the beginning. I think that the question is how sticky this change is.
Yeah.
Because, I think that we went through the initial phase of everything is new and, this is new. We're working from home, we're working remotely. And I don't remember how many days or for how long you have to start doing something, to keep doing something before you become a habit. Yeah. But probably, it's been long enough for stuff to become habits. And I guess it's, personally, living in a one-bedroom flat with no garden and no family and nobody, I think it's been 6 weeks since I last had a conversation in person with anybody. I am feeling the fatigue of doing everything through this medium. Yeah. It's a combination of things. It's to some degree, it's even a matter of posture. I mean, the fact that, every conversation you have, you're sitting on a desk in front of a screen.
It's true.
Is, so true. I try to move around I use my iPad for friends conversation and my Mac for work conversations. But, I can't say that I can't wait for this to be over so we can go back to having meetings. But I haven't seen yet, at least in my personal experience, that step forward where we say, okay, it can't continue like this. We need to change the way we do things. So maybe we need to do less meetings. The point is not, we do meetings on Zoom, we do meeting in person. It's, do we need to have all these meetings? Do we need to become smarter about, they call it smart working, but it is truly, in many cases, the same dumb working we were doing before. We're just doing it on a phone. So it's and it is probably very likely that at this point, from where we are now, from where I can see, this will continue for quite a while, because yes, they might let us get out in a few weeks, but if you can work from home, you probably should continue working from home for some indefinite future. So we're going to have plenty of time to fix things, to improve things, but I think that basically, there has been the initial curve of excitement, then there has been this slope of despair, and whatever will come out of this is probably going to be the sticky bit. And I'm curious to see what is going to happen, but I would say that it hasn't happened yet. Maybe there is a predisposition for it, but I'm still waiting to see the change.
If we had show titles, the sticky bit would be a prime candidate, wouldn't it?
Well, you know that I need to pick 2 words to put in the.
Oh, well, there you go.
I have it.
But it's interesting. I mean, watching again my wife, who's doing constant online meetings, and like you, she's suffering physically from just that constant single position, and has made efforts to try and change that. And again, totally, you're right about the way we're just at the moment replicating what we used to do, but in a virtual way. And I saw an article that was a conversation that Ross Mayfield was taking part in. And for those of you who don't know, he was one of the sort of early folks who built software to help collaboration in an enterprise setting. And we were just saying that there are so many other options and mixes of options, and some of us who've been around begin to appreciate the benefits of asynchronous conversations and all the other stuff that's possible. But as you say, most people are still rushing into just doing what they do normally, but in a different and sometimes less effective way. And just talking about the good old days in a sense, Doc Searles shared an article he wrote in 1995, so pre his blog, about the internet and the way it was going to change things. And it was just really interesting going back and reading it, because I had read it when it first came out, but going back and reading it with what we now are experiencing. And, that's one of the things that, in a sense, keeps me optimistic, that in the same ways it's been incredibly frustrating how long it seems to have been taking most people to catch up with what's possible. This is speeding it up, albeit they're not going to immediately rush into sort of effective creative uses of this stuff. There's a lot of catching up to be done, a lot of reinvention to be. I think we'll come out of this with potentially with new tools and new mixes of tools and new organisations that will enable those new mixes of tools. We're still wedging this into a current conception of what an organisation is and what it looks like and what it feels like.
But I agree, it could be an opportunity. There is definitely some movement. I was chatting with Matt Moore early today, and he was saying too, it feels a little bit like 2002, when a lot of when Ross Mayfield was doing that work, where we were doing the work, where when we all first met. And I think that at that point we were coming out of the burst bubble of 2001, but there was this idea of trying to find new tools and trying to find new ways to organize information, to manage information, to you were in charge of knowledge management, but
my dark past.
It might very well be possible that this time around, instead of being the 6 of us plotting in the dark, there might be users for this, because like it or not, for the last 10 years, Facebook and Apple and Google have been training people to use tools in a way that in 2002 just did not exist. I mean, when we created our first, Matt went down memory lane a couple of days ago, and we found a whole bunch of links to our own K collector or aggregator and our stuff. And back in that day, the idea of a stream of news that you would just scroll down was odd. I mean, we had to convince people that the idea that you scroll down a page and you find information after information was a viable way of finding stuff. While, nowadays it's the default way to consume information that pretty much everybody is using. So I wonder if, we could have this renaissance of... is there some room to create new tools, to imagine new ways to use the tools that we have to, make things better? Because to be honest, last time we tried, we failed.
Yeah, well, and I was also going to say that I think part of the risk or the challenge is that you need to have a different mindset as well as new tools. And I think too much faith has been placed in technology as a sort of magic wand that will make people better. But people have to change as well, and their perspectives of what they want have to change. And, again, I wrote a post about less and becoming comfortable with less, and that's maybe something we will all have to achieve. And, I think this is independent of coronavirus. I think this was something that was going to hit us anyway in terms of automation, and however fast automation and AI happened, I think there's a very strong likelihood that more significant percentages of the population will not have what's conventionally thought of as a job. We've talked about this before, and that will take quite a lot of individual and societal adjustment in terms of what we value, how we value it, who we recognise, who we don't. And again, even just, through this set of circumstances, people who were deemed unskilled labour by Priti Patel only 3 or 4 months ago are now completely crucial people in society. People like drivers, people who work in shops, people who work in hospitals, and all the bullshit jobs. You're kind of able to sit and do the bullshit work sitting at home. You begin to think, well, how important are all of those jobs? And so I think that's, I think we should be being brave and thinking as big as we can at the moment. And even down to a funny mutual friend of ours, Fleming Funch, has just shared an article about how scientists are postulating off the back of, I can't remember the computer scientist guy who suggested that the whole world was a computer simulation, and as a philosophical challenge, how would we know, sort of thing. And this is beginning to talk about quantum physicists talking about the universe creating the image of itself that we experience, and that it's not actually there, it's just a set of holograms almost. I didn't fully read the article. But just chatting to Fleming in the comments, I was saying, well, it's fascinating how that article didn't even reference the fact that mystics, however you define mystic, but Buddhists or Hindus or Christian mystics have said that for thousands of years, that the whole thing is a construct and is part of our biological capability to have imagination. And, if you're having those sort of scale of shifts happening at the same time, then this fixation with the material world and getting more of the stuff in that material world at the cost of our ability to survive as a species starts to look decidedly problematic, And so again, it'd be really, really sad if we just came out of this with the same bloody blinkered, I've got to get the latest, best, biggest thingy, and I'm quite happy to screw up my life and the planet at the same time.
Well, as usual, it's probably going to mostly be a matter of how many people are going to change their position, their ideas, and the way they perceive the world. In the sense that I still see plenty of people that I wouldn't trust with anything being out there, and I don't have
name any names.
I don't have huge expectations there. But I mean, just it hasn't happened here yet, but it's probably going to happen within the next 2 weeks. I can see the future. It's called Italy. I can time travel. I can time travel. I can see the future 2 weeks. I can see 2 weeks in the future. So in 2 weeks here, the government will announce an app that will help with the contact tracing initiative, and people will freak out about their privacy, and they will say that this is a police state, try to control us, and then confusion will ensue.
But that's interesting, because we shared an article by Mark Manson about just how nobody's got a fucking clue what's going on, and we get fed all this information about who's doing what and what's working, what's not, what statistics are true. You know, last week I think smokers were more likely to die. This week there's less likely to die, and we make you know, I'm not saying you don't have foresight into the future, Paolo, but you know, we've got this sort of idea that just because something has happened somewhere else, it will happen the same way where we are. And that's nonsense too, because we're, you know, how different communities, different cultures, different groups of people react to things is more different, I think, than we're sort of clinging to the idea that this is somehow manageable and we can predict it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I mostly have the desperate feeling that mistakes were made in one place 2 weeks ago, and here the same mistakes are being made just 2 weeks later, and this feels particularly stupid because you could just seen what the other time had done something different. Because, I mean, yes, maybe it's not the same people, the same situation, but just try to do something different for the sake of it, because doing the same thing, so far, if you look at all the curves are just perfectly aligned. And it's almost desperate, and you look at this, and you know, I think we discussed about last week about you know, Google and Apple effort in doing their building the features in their systems. What is interesting is that I don't know if you noticed, in the last update from Apple, they started calling it exposure notification. No. Instead of contact tracing, and it's very clever, because actually
that's interesting,
it's you know, it's a name, but you know, it's not, they're not tracing contact, they're just notifying exposure,
alerting you. Yes, it's in your interest to know.
So it is interesting how most government in Europe were aligned in something called the Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Act.
That trips off the tongue, doesn't it?
Is a PPPPPT, and basically the idea of this was it was based on a central repository information. And I think the last one was Germany, that yesterday stepped away from that standard and embraced Apple and Google standard, which is completely decentralized.
Really interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
And this is basically the French government. The French government like tried to push Apple, saying, you know, you have to do this, and Apple said no. The German government said, Google and Apple, you have to do what we want, and Google and Apple said no.
Yep.
And now you're saying, all right, then we'll just do what Apple and Google do. Huh? Yeah. It's like, okay, it's a good thing, because I trust way more Apple and Google to come up with a standard than, you know, the usual suspects. It's interesting how they try to resist it, but the funny thing is that basically, in order to do what the European governments wanted to do, they would have had to create an app that would have had always to be the front app with the phone turned on. Yeah. Which basically would have been, you know, you have 2 hours autonomy and then the phone dies. But in order to have this thing working in the background, if Apple and Google don't give you the API, you just can't do it. And so Apple and Google just won. But so it's
interesting you're saying that you try, because I'm the same. I it's a big word, trust, isn't it? But I'm more comfortable.
Let's say that, you know, you don't trust anybody 100%, but you have shades of trust, right?
Yeah. And the fact that we, I suppose, are geeky enough to know that that decentralized principle matters. You know, it's again, it's this thing about learning enough about technology to know what's being done to you, or for you, or on your behalf, or whatever. I think is again an important element of what's happening. That even just the fuss around Zoom and the security around that, it's no bad thing that more people are getting more savvy about and not being so dismissive about technology, because that set of judgments as to what we are comfortable with need to be better informed.
But it's always a tiny minority that makes these changes, right? So I guess that the point here is that what I'm happy about is that a private company that has nothing to do whatsoever with democracy is actually making decision against the democratically elected governments about our privacy. And we're basically happy with it, which is odd if you think about it.
Well, that's what I'm saying, but it's because we understand, the risks of the alternative, I guess.
But I think that what is interesting is that we're trusting a minority instead of the majority, right? So the point is we're not going with what most people would want to do, which is essentially probably elect fascist politician. Actually, this is exactly what they're doing, and trying to find ways for minorities of probably people that care more about something to influence the direction of society. Is this good? Is this bad? I mean, I suppose that it is good in this situation, but is this under control in any way, shape, or form? No.
It's really interesting because it sort of harks back. It's I got a slight whiff of the way we got into the problem with Trump and Boris about populism and a liberal elite knowing what's good for people. And I worked for an organisation for 21 years that was sort of founded on the principle of knowing what was good for people. And in a sense, we are saying that Google and Apple know what's good for people.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that right now they're behaving and they have the power to do it.
Yep.
So it's another of those interesting conundrums that this whole crisis is exposing, right? It's not only how much is a life worth, and 10 and 100, where do you stop? And I guess the other thing is, where is this happening? I mean, I was reading a couple of days ago, a Bangladeshi minister sent an appeal for these thousands of Rohingya try to run away from Myanmar. They tried to get to Malaysia. They were pushed back. I mean, these are floating on ships in the middle of the ocean. There are thousands of them. Apparently, there are 1 million refugees, and the minister basically said, why don't I think that he specifically pointed the finger at the UK. Why don't you take some? That would be a very cheap thing to do,
no.
Right? It wouldn't be that hard. Yeah. That's not going to happen. So because we care about life more than the economy, but we care about life of the Britishers but more than life of others. So it's
well. Again, that's one of the things that sense of division and getting woo-woo again for a minute, the whole thing about the self and other and the whole narrative around this little me that I have to protect and defend against all comers and blah blah blah. But we are all actually an intrinsic part of the life of this planet, just trundling along doing what it does without us having any remote idea why or any sense of control over it. And as more people, hopefully, and I'm more and more overt about talking about it, become aware that that's actually what's happening, that we don't have control, all our plans and all our busyness is kind of happening around us and to us, then things like wars or things like not helping each other or seeing a zero-sum game in terms of resources begin to look counterproductive, not productive. It's all of us that are in this, and screwing somebody else means you're screwing yourself.
Oh, well, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's if there is one thing that we might expect from all this is going to be international collaboration around healthcare.
Yeah.
Because it's much more effective if we all try to find a vaccine or a cure, or than if each and every individual country start doing it. But also, if we help poorer countries to fight this and to be more prepared for this, it means that the next time it starts in any of these countries, they will have the tool to fight it before it gets here. So it's in everybody's interest to try to do better than we have.
Certainly for the first time. And that's what, again, is exciting about the technology, because the first opportunity we've had as a planetary species to be forced to deal with an issue that, by its very nature, crosses all the boundaries that we set up. We have a technology that allows us to do the same while we're talking about it, if we choose to make it useful for that.
Yeah, it's the first time that as a species we have global real-time communication when a global event hits us.
Yep.
Let's see what we do with it, but
better bloody get it right, don't we?
Well, I mean, I think you sent this morning the article by Mark Manson. And I very much liked at the beginning. He said no one has any idea what the fuck is happening or what we should do about it.
Yep.
Which I think is a very, very accurate description of the current situation. And it's interesting in trying to handle this uncertainty and trying to see what will come out of this is definitely going to be interesting.
But also, so a couple of the people when I posted about what matters and taking the opportunity to think about what matters, I think it was Rick Ladd, who may listen to this podcast. He said, well, I can do that once somebody's covered my mortgage payments and my blah, blah, and whatever. And again, not dismissing the challenge that meeting financial, which I'm facing to some extent as well, that we all do. I'm not dismissing that. But equally, expecting somebody else to sort it out is still part of that world where you've got people in charge, systems that are meant to work, and you collapse if they don't. And that's one of the things I took from the Mark Manson article. And it's not even just talking to my girls this morning. I know one of our friends is really stressing over failing in his role to provide for his family. And we were chatting about this, and I just looked at the girls and said, well, you've known you're on your own for some time, haven't you? But in a sense, that was what I saw as my job, was giving them the wherewithal and the outlook and the inclination to look after themselves. I'm not saying I'm not caring what happens to my kids, but I don't want my kids to depend on me, and I don't want them to depend on a government either. I don't want them to depend on some corporate entity, to whatever extent is possible. And this is why it's really, really hard, because we've got so embedded into this world of expecting somebody else to look after us. But that might be one of the things that we come out of this with.
Did you... I think I sent you a link a couple of weeks ago of a video on YouTube of Smarter Every Day, where these guys show how they organize local production of 3D printed masks.
Yes.
And I think that what was especially interesting there is that they were not only sharing the design, so they were not only sharing the 3D file that you need to print to make the masks, but they were sharing the methodology and the approach.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you organize yourself to do that? How do you find the people? How do you find the place? How do you disinfect? How you distribute? And I think it was very interesting because this was clearly a grassroots organization that was basically creating the basis to replicate itself.
Yes, exactly that. And that's where I was sort of going with my thinking, that everybody has their own capacity within their own sphere of influence to build similar networks and capabilities.
I guess the important thing is, what do you do with these networks and capabilities, and how do you make them resilient? How do you create a system that, even if you don't know everybody that you need to know, you can still start building it and get somewhere and get a result? Because, the real trick here is, how do you create self-replicating resilient initiatives that leverage the network effect to have a global impact? And it's possible. I will post a link to the video. It's very interesting, but I haven't seen that many of these situation starts, and I think what was interesting is that the way he was describing it is saying this can be used to make 3D printed masks, but same approach can be used to any number of different things. So first thing, figure out what your community needs, and then organize or create a self-organized system that can basically satisfy the need of a community. It's very interesting. It's incredibly powerful.
It's sort of going back to the cathedral and the bazaar again, isn't it? And when you were describing that system where you don't need to know people to trust them, made me think of Linux and open source software, and was hailed as a revolutionary way of doing things that never really made the transition from software to the real world, as it were. But again, I think that's partly down to the critical mass of people who believe it's possible. And so many of us, brainwashed is too deliberate, but we've all sort of fallen into this dream, this sleep of thinking we can't do that. It's not true.
I think that the trick here is, how do we create the environment or the tools that allow people to contribute?
Yes.
Because, we can't expect everybody to build their own tools. I like to think of myself as a tool maker. I've been building digital tools for, the last 30 years. So what is that we can create that will empower communities to do something? Because it's all about creating meaningful frameworks. Yesterday I watched a movie on Prime called The Professor and the Madman.
That's it.
Which is a story of how the initial version of the English Oxford Dictionary came to be. And they basically put out an appeal for definition of words. And anybody could send that in a definition. Anybody could find in a book the usage of a word, and they could just copy the quotation and send it back.
Fantastic.
And turns out that more than 10,000 of these contributions were sent by an American former army captain who was in an asylum in the UK. He was mad. Like, he had killed somebody and he was kept in an asylum. But he is one of the best contributors. At some point, he was recognized as a contributor of the initial effort. And
how many of those words are now in common usage and shape the worlds that we live in?
But what is fascinating is that they had tried to compile a dictionary to begin with, but they failed to do it because it was such a huge effort. The way it worked is because this other guy, the professor, who was Scottish, actually. So basically, the first English dictionary was made by a Scot and an American. Came up with this idea of asking for help.
Yeah.
And they basically posted everywhere. They were in every book published, they would put a note saying, "We're trying to do this, so why don't you help us?" Yeah. And you create a framework allowing people to contribute to help, and you can do amazing things.
It's like the Captain Tom story getting 12 million quid, or when they asked for volunteers for the NHS, they were inundated with people stepping forward for that. And, the tool could even just be that kind of an intervention technology necessarily.
Oh, no, absolutely. But needs to be a framework that allows some type of action.
And makes it clear and obvious what you could possibly contribute to that. It's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it beats clapping every Thursday evening.
But it's tapping into the same, I think, growing instinct. I think people are, when they're less busy, they're more aware of how much they need to look after each other. I find it really, really interesting, because I think, I hope politicians are going to find it hard to keep a lid on this. They're increasingly looking more than stupid, just out of touch. With notable exceptions, which we've talked about before, like Jacinda Ardern and others. But conventional politics is just really not keeping up with the mood of people. And I don't just mean my little bubble in the southeast,
That's why the Prime Minister... That's why the Prime Minister managed to remove himself from the scene for 3
Well, at least he wasn't telling people to inject bloody bleach.
Oh, very much. I'm very happy.
We've avoided it so far, but it had to be talked about, didn't it?
Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
Was that the elephant in the room?
Now I feel better. Yeah.
Well, that's just us both up, isn't it? It's a day.
And on this optimistic note, I think we're ready to call this a day. Thank you very much for listening, and tune in for the next episodes sometime in the future.